Michael Daniel was our guest. Mr. Daniel is the President's cybersecurity coordinator, and he was talking about the executive order that the President recently issued. Well, this week we have two members of Congress to discuss that executive order and get the reaction from Capitol Hill. Joining us first is Representative Mac Thornberry, a Republican of Texas, member of the Intelligence Committee, and in the last Congress, Task Force Chair on Cybersecurity for the Speaker. Mr. Thornberry, when you look at the President's executive order from February 2013, what's your initial reaction?
That it's okay. There are some things that clearly need to be done with an executive order, but some things can only be done with legislation. So part of my reaction is I wish the President had put as much effort into getting some legislation passed and then come out with the executive order rather than the other way around, because I guess one of my fears is it could potentially take some momentum out of the effort to get legislation passed.
Now, how similar is the President's executive order to the task force recommendations that you made last Congress?
Some things in the executive order are exactly as we recommended that the administration do. For example, the federal government being more careful about the computers it buys and having higher standards with its purchasing power is a good and helpful step. We talked about having voluntary standards for private industry so that they could know what they needed to do, they could tell how close they were to reaching certain goals, and I think that's the direction that the executive order wants to go. What we don't know yet is the standards that NIST will come up with, how they would be enforced, and there's still some anxiety about the administration trying to do too much by direct regulation rather than voluntary incentives that get market forces working to improve our cybersecurity.
What about in the definition of critical infrastructure? Is there agreement there?
Well, I think it's kind of one of those things. Most of us know what some critical infrastructure is, electricity grid, etc. Exactly how the administration chooses to define specific industries and then what comes with that, I think we don't know yet from the executive order. You know, the executive order sets up a process that is just beginning and will take several years to complete. So that's why on its face, there's a lot that I think a lot of us think is going in the right direction, but the way it's implemented is going to tell us a lot about whether it's effective or not.
Well, Representative Thornberry, we want to play a little of Michael Daniel, the White House cybersecurity coordinator from last week, talking about the executive order and federal regulations. Here is Mr. Daniel.
If they believe that their regulations or requirements are not sufficient in that area, then they could, in theory, impose new regulations or executive actions that would require infrastructure to be brought up to that level. But I think for the most part, you're going to find that it will be a voluntary process for companies to participate.
Representative Thornberry?
Yeah. Well, I think what he was referring to is that existing regulators of industries can put new requirements to improve cybersecurity in the industries that it already regulates. And that general approach is exactly what we recommended in our task force report. In other words, you don't need another regulator to come in and regulate the cybersecurity part of the electricity industry. They have existing regulators, and you need to work through them to improve cybersecurity. And I think that is preferable. But I also believe we got to be careful about too much emphasis on direct regulation. Remember, these are threats that come at us at the speed of light, and the threats change just about as fast. So the idea that too rigid a government regulation can solve this, I think, is just misguided and wrong. What you need is the voluntary incentives for industries to keep up with it on their own. There's no way that a government regulatory process will ever be able to do that.
What about when it comes to liability issues?
Yeah. The key concern for liability is if an industry has threat information, it would like to share some of that information with the government. There's a fear that they could be sued by shareholders or customers for sharing information with the government. So this is one of the areas that legislation is required. Now, you still have to have privacy protections. You don't want to give away people's personal identifiable information, but there has to be a way for information sharing, the government sharing with private industry and private industry sharing back with the government. That's the only way that our country can be more secure, but there's going to have to be some changes and protections in the law in order to facilitate that sort of exchange.
Are there limitations on information sharing between companies?
Sure, absolutely. There are now. Antitrust laws limit some of that. Liability laws limit some of that. Some of the regulations from the regulators limit some of that. And again, this is always a balancing act. So you don't want companies in the same industry to share so much information that you get into serious antitrust issues. But on the other hand, we don't want to just let the theoretical be the enemy of the good. So, for example, there's been a lot in the news lately about attacks coming against major U.S. financial institutions. They need to be able to share that information about those attacks so they can better protect themselves. And so making sure that there's not legal liability or other legal concerns, facilitating that exchange is part of where we need to go, I think.
Mac Thornberry, when it comes to cybersecurity, how do you see the role of the federal government in protecting private institutions, such as banks, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an evolving question. On the Armed Services Committee, I had a hearing 2 years ago, and I asked this basic question. If a bunch of bombers were coming to bomb refineries, we know what we would expect the federal government to do to protect those refineries from being destroyed. If it's a bunch of packets coming through the internet against the same refineries, we don't know what we expect. So I think the role of the federal government in defending the country in cyberspace, especially against these sophisticated state level actors, is evolving, where I do think the government has to be actively involved in defending us. And a secondary role is the federal government facilitating the kinds of protection and defensive measures that we can take for ourselves and that companies can take for themselves. So I think those are the two roles: protecting against the sophisticated actors and encouraging a higher state of cybersecurity and preparedness for everybody else.
I want to play a little bit more of Michael Daniel from last week talking about the private sector.
One of the questions that I think we're currently wrestling with is exactly what is the government's role in providing cybersecurity to the private sector. At what point does the government intervene? Under what conditions? I think all of those are still questions that, while they are much more well developed in the physical realm, we're still trying to figure out what those rules of the road are.